The United States says the African Union's presence at G20 proceedings under its presidency will ensure that African countries are well represented. Now, Washington has reiterated its stance on snubbing South Africa after Pretoria delegates were not invited to some of the first diplomatic engagements in December. Several countries have raised objections to the U.S. decision to exclude South Africa from this year's engagement. Let's discuss this now with former diplomat and international relations expert, Dr. Kingsley Makhubela. Good morning and welcome to Newzroom Afrika. Doctor, first and foremost, in simple terms, what does South Africa's exclusion from the 2026 G20 actually mean for our country's diplomatic standing?
Good morning, Ms. Chaba. It's just unfortunate that the United States has taken this unilateral decision to exclude South Africa. It has serious consequences in terms of the representation of African countries within the G20. And South Africa being the biggest economy and representing not only the interests of the country, but looking into SADC and even East Africa, South Africa was better poised to articulate issues of the developing countries, particularly the African continent. The African Union representation there, will not have the impact of member state because the African Union has no mandate from member state to speak on specific issues. Yet South Africa can, within the context of its own articulation of issues, encompass the interests of other members of the African Union. And this will be unfortunate.
Now, in this exclusion, a procedural, political, or is it just personal? Who ultimately benefits from it?
Ms. Chaba, it's the fracturing of the international global system and the emergence of new power that is causing this constellation and uncertainty. And the United States keeps on taking the view that South Africa is fraternizing with its arch-rivals. And that's why South Africa is included. But the very same arch-rivals are going to be sitting around the table. But the tension that is building around the world powers and the configuration of this multilateral institution is raising serious concern. You know, the United States has been of the view that maybe China and the United States should form the G2 and be able to impose their hegemony on the rest of the world. The Chinese are unlikely to go for this. But what we are seeing, we're starting to see the United States really withdrawing and taking a position of the G1. The G1 meaning that the United States speaks to itself and nothing else. So the grouping are no longer going to be relevant. You have seen the similar attitude towards the G7. Now we're seeing it in the G20. So the United States has become very much isolated and it's undermining a multilateral system around the world.
Now, Doctor, the U.S. says the African Union's presence at the G20 is enough to represent Africa, including South Africa. Now, can a multilateral body like the AU realistically substitute for the voice of a sovereign state with its own economic and geopolitical interests?
Absolutely, Ms. Chala. The AU has no mandate to do that. You may also recall there's been a lot of debate within the AU about disengagement, AU, China, AU, US, AU, Russia, that perhaps maybe we need to relook at this thing. But the difference is that if you compare the AU and the European Union, the AU has no specific mandate to represent member states on any of the issues. It has, of course, the responsibility to galvanize and mobilize support, but it doesn't have specific mandate to speak on those issues.
Sure.
And the AU has been included to strengthen the voice of South Africa within the G20. Now, it's actually puzzling that strengthening the voice means taking out one voice. But at the crux of this, Ms. Chaba, is the fact that the United States has no mandate to unilaterally alter and reconfigure the composition of the G20 without the concurrence of the rest of the members.
But Doctor, what does it say about global governance when South Africa is told to be represented rather than represent itself?
Well, the United States, we know, Ms. Chaba, is undermining all institutions of global governance. President Trump has made it quite clear that he's not going to be guided by international law. He'll be guided by his own intuition and moral standing. No one knows what are this intuition and moral standing. The world must be guided by international law, the rules that everyone has accepted. You may have seen the United States withdrawing from a lot of multilateral initiatives and treaties that the United States has signed. So we're seeing this withdrawal of the United States on crucial issues that have the capacity to resolve global issues. And it's unfortunate because the new multipolar world would function much better with the United States on the table. But with the United States in isolation, it's not going to work out much better for the rest of the world.
Now, Dr. South Africa just hosted a highly successful G20 summit right here in Gauteng. The national government under President Ramaphosa, of course, working alongside Premier Panyaza Lesufi's provincial administration, demonstrated to the world that South Africa can deliver a world-class international event with professionalism and excellence. Now, could our success have become a political problem for those who prefer to see us as dependent rather than capable?
You know, South Africa has done well, Maschaba, in terms of reaching consensus because the G20 works on the basis of consensus. And issues that were included, that were discussed during this G20 that South Africa hosted, it was very broad in their outreach. Members of the civil society were able to make contribution on critical issues because Maschaba foreign policy has evolved so much. Civil society plays a crucial role in terms of this intergovernmental organization. And that has been a precedent that has been set up, be it the climate change conference and so on. There's a great deal of involvement and contribution by civil society and other formation in the societies. So this is helping in terms of strengthening and building a much stronger and resilient international global system that are able to really be sensitive to issues that are affecting people across the political divide, because members of the civil society represent very broad framework of the society.
Now, is South Africa being punished for its independent foreign policy or ICJ case against Israel or BRICS membership or our refusal to condemn Russia rather than any actual violation of G20 norms?
Maschaba is this emerging multipolar world that even South Africa cannot clearly define what are the sources of power. It's causing this constellation, this uncertainty, this suspicion. And of course, the United States for many years has been working on the basis of them and us. So if you are seen to be much closer to the Chinese or the Russians, you are seen as an adversary. You may have seen the national security strategy released by the United States in the last 2 months. It spells out what their expectations are. It spells out who their enemies are. It spells out how they're going to deal with the rest of us. So that is contained within the broad strategic framework of the United States. And unfortunately, South Africa has an independent foreign policy. And South Africa, even though in certain instances, I must confess, South Africa is being coerced and pulled in all sorts of directions, sometimes without even properly evaluating all these lobbies that are coming before South Africa.
Sure. Let's delve into that a little bit deeper, Doctor. Now, how much of this decision is linked to South Africa's case against Israel at the ICJ? And to what extent is our relationship with China and Russia and Iran influencing Washington's decisions?
Well, Maschaba, Washington has made it quite clear that the relationship that South Africa has with Russia, Iran, and China is unacceptable. Not only this administration, you remember the strategic document that Blinken, who was the Secretary of State, presented during his visit to South Africa here. It contains those articulations. So that has been a clear indication from Washington about how they want to deal with South Africa. The Trump administration is on steroids in terms of implementing those decisions. So these are systemic issues that are contained within the Washington thinking. The unfortunate thing, Maschaba, is there's still a thinking. I'm perplexed to see this within South Africa, that the Democrats in Washington are still to the left. The Democrats, to a very large extent, have moved a bit to the right. the left have basically collapsed, not only in Washington, around the world. The left has left us. So relying only on dealing with the left, it's not an issue. What South Africa needs to do now is to go back to the drawing board and really develop a strategy that will deal with the right, the center right, that is also starting to fracture, and also how to deal with the possibility of the far right government. So South Africa doesn't have strategies around this thing.
Sure.
That's why we don't even have an ambassador in Washington as we're talking.
Now, speaking of which, Doctor, now Germany, China, France, the EU, Brazil, Canada, and others have reportedly objected to South Africa's exclusion. So what does this level of support actually tell us?
You know, Matshaba, there are bigger issues that they're confronted with the Europeans now. Their main issue now is around Greenland. South Africa is not going to be the issue. South Africa can be the issue that they sit around the table and argue with the United States about. There are bigger issues to deal with. You may have seen there's a convergence between the Europeans and the Americans when it comes to Iran. You may have seen Frederick Metz's statement on the 14th of January with respect to Iran when he said, well, the Iran leadership is in its final days or weeks, meaning that the unrest that were going on there, that was, excuse me, in relations to the military exercises that were taking place in South Africa, that the Europeans were very much opposed to that. And this statement by Friedrich Merz, the chancellor in Germany, makes it quite clear. So there are certain areas of convergence between the US and the Europeans. South Africa will remain isolated. And South Africa, unfortunately, has taken sides in this conflict between the United States and the Europeans, has taken sides of the Europeans.
We're going to have to wrap it up, but I've got two very important questions for you. So, Doctor, very briefly, can the G20 still present itself as a legitimate global economic forum if founding members can be sidelined unilaterally?
It raises question then. The next host may decide we don't want X country and X country can participate. So that's where the precedent setting would emerge. And it would depend on how ministers and heads of state are going to handle this. So we'll see moving forward.
And then before we let you go, finally, what are South Africa's realistic options now? Do we pursue confrontation or quiet diplomacy? Do we work through BRICS and the AU or take this to other multilateral forums?
I think South Africa should continue to lobby the rest of the member states to raise this issue at every level of the G20, be it at the ministerial, even at the summit level. South Africa should keep on raising this thing. And maybe in the final communique, if South Africa is not included, you know, a chapeau would be included in the statement of heads of state that would indicate the exclusion of South Africa does not necessarily mean a precedence, that moving forward, this would be the position. Hopefully that would save a multilateral institution that is emerging, that works on consensus, actually, that even the voices of the smaller economies within the group matters.
Thank you so much for your time, Doctor. Always a pleasure chatting with you.
It's a pleasure, Ms. Shaba. Thanks indeed.
That was former diplomat and international relations expert, Dr. Kingsley Makhubela.